Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. For this week's video, I want to present another layout design, and this is for an HO scale layout in a rather cramped space. It is an upgraded conservatory on the outside of a house, and it's a little bit awkward. Overall, it's around 17 feet by 10 something, so around 180 square feet total. Although there are 3 doors, 2 of which open into the room. There's also a plumbing access panel which has to stay available. There's a lot of windows, although the client was okay with covering them. There's an AC unit in one corner. Fortunately, it is low enough to allow the benchwork to proceed over it unhindered. The only window he wanted to keep access to is the high level one along this wall. So although there are a lot of obstructions, they are restricted to one wall, which is very fortunate. Now the client wanted to operate first generation diesels, and he wanted to represent a main line with through trains. We talked about equipment choices, and the vast majority of the client's diesels are 4 axles, which is fortunate because we're going to be restricted on curve radius. Anyway, with the requirement for running through freights, I first thought of a folded dog bone, and I tried to start with a 30-inch minimum radius curve. But already it looks as though that is going to severely restrict the aisle width. At first I didn't want to go any sharper than 30 inches because the client mentioned a desire to run early piggyback cars, which were some of the longest cars ever built at around 89 feet. But further discussion with the client revealed that he was perfectly happy to compromise on the curve radius and run a slightly earlier single trailer piggyback. And those were only 50 feet long, so he's going to run those instead. So I dropped the curve radius first to 27 inches, and we ended up on the final design with 24 inches, because even with a 27-inch curve, the entry aisle is still kind of tight unless you want to sacrifice a lot of length on this side of the room. But limiting the equipment to 40 and 50 foot cars and 4-axle diesels, the 24-inch radius curves will look fine, provided we keep the easements. The client was hoping for a continuous loop, although it was not high on his list of priorities. I did sketch one plan that tried to get a continuous loop in on at least one level, but it really compromised the rest of the plan. The shape of the room just did not lend itself to doing that. Anyway, here is the footprint that we ended up with. We've now got a 30-inch entry aisle, with the main operating space being 36 inches wide. And something else we discussed was access to the door to the workshop. We decided to build a swing gate on the lower level only, with the upper deck being fixed, there being a duct under with around 50 something inches of clearance. And the client agreed with me that that was going to be an acceptable compromise, considering how much having the opening on both levels would have restricted the plan. Now schematically, I'm attempting to get staging at both ends. Now this plan still shows the continuous loop. It's basically a folded figure 8. We have the main yard along the north side of the room, which is the only place remotely long enough for it. Put a few staging tracks behind it, and then continue the main line through the staging yard to hook up with the top lap of the helix and return to the upper deck again. And then on the lower deck there'd be a scenic run along the outside of the helix, a small town under the main yard, and then once again staging behind it. And I've extended the staging tracks into a reversing loop under the helix. Note how the helix is elongated in the same way that I did on the dining room central build, because a 24-inch radius circle does not have enough lap length for a workable helix. But by elongating it slightly, we're able to gain the same lap length as a 30-inch radius helix, allowing for a 4-inch rise per lap with a 2% grade. Now normally at this point in a layout design I go into the most complex areas, which in this layout are on the upper deck. But the client and I had had a lot of discussion on what he wanted to include on the lower deck, so I continue to work on that next. This view shows how the lower deck eventually evolved. The staging yard has been reduced to a stub-ended yard because the lower level reversing loop would have made the moving section across the workshop door extremely complicated. So rather than running through staging, around the loop and then back onto the visible portion of the railroad again. Trains will be staged between sessions, and there is a reversing loop in this corner. The second leg of it is disguised as an interchange. The track crossing our main line is simply a dummy, but the interchange track is fully operational, so it is a working industry during operating sessions. This second track around the inside of the reversing loop is optional. It allows any cars spotted on the interchange track to be quickly pushed out of the way to make the reversing loop available for turning trains. So it's desirable, even though I say it's optional. The staging tracks are all in the range of 10 to 12 feet long, so that allows for 2 4-axle diesels with a decent length of train. And at this point in the process, we're still talking about a mine in this location, although that eventually got changed to a quarry. The client also mentioned at this time that he wanted to represent a railroad running along the banks of the Susquehanna River. And since that is a fairly broad, flat river, including the trestle right next to it wasn't really going to work well. So to get around that, we divided the scene, and then from the river scene, the helix makes one lap before bursting out into the trestle scene at a higher elevation. So with 1.5 laps of grade, the trestle could be high enough and also far enough separated from the river scene to be able to work. The reduced clearance between decks at this point isn't a problem, since this scene is very narrow, and also the scene above it is at the highest elevation on the railroad as well. And as a side advantage with doing it this way, it means that the trains are hidden for a shorter time, since the hidden portion of the helix is now 1 lap less than it would otherwise have been. Here I'm working on the upper deck. With wanting to keep as much benchwork area available for a yard as possible, I put in only 4 staging tracks in the upper yard instead of 6 on the lower yard. And in this plan, I'm attempting to go with through staging and a reversing loop to allow trains to be recycled at this end. The grades on track X and Y are a little complex, as is the benchwork in this area. So ultimately we abandoned that and went with stub ending tracks at this end as well. And although it's an early diesel era layout, a small secondary line in that period would probably have the steam facilities in existence repurposed for servicing diesels. They certainly wouldn't have spent a lot of money building new diesel shops. So the roundhouse is still in use for servicing diesels. The coal delivery track now serves for storing maintenance away equipment. The coal tower is still standing. Often concrete coal towers were left in place decades after the demise of steam because of the difficulty of demolishing them, although all the ironwork would have been sold for scrap. Instead of a sand drying house, the sand is delivered already pre-dried in covered hoppers, and we're assuming that the sand storage is the body of a 2-bay covered hopper raised on legs over the tracks, as is quite common. In this next view, we can see the simplified arrangement of the staging yard, and I've also incorporated a reversing loop in this corner directly above the lower one for turning trains between sessions. And the plan is to disguise this portion of the reversing loop as an industrial spur. Now, to get around the limited staging capacity at this end, being only 4 tracks and having to mirror the 6-track yard on the bottom level, we've decided that 2 of the trains are going to terminate at this yard. And in order to provide enough local traffic for terminating trains, we've included a 3-track interchange yard sneaking off through the backdrop and over the helix. That means that a fair number of cars can be used up stuffing these 3 tracks, and they can be switched out more than once in a session as well. A morning train can arrive with mostly cars for this interchange, switch out what's already on there and return to the lower staging, and then later in the session the operator can assume that these now represent the new cars that have just been switched by the other railroad, thus helping to offset the limited capacity in the upper staging yard. This next drawing is basically the same as the last one, but with straight curved and easemented track shown. I normally do all my design work with the colours turned on and only switch it back when I'm ready to send the client a drawing. You may have noticed an annotation on some earlier drawings that this area over the helix was earmarked for a paper mill. From early in the process, the client and I had discussed the possibility of making this whole side of the room a single large industry. And when I suggested a paper mill, the client jumped at the idea. They are such interesting industries to model, incorporating numerous car spots with many different types of cars. So basically it's like switching a dozen smaller industries all tied together. And almost invariably they have their own yards as well. There wasn't room for a double-ended yard, so I ran a single-ended yard off the front edge of the fascia, implying that it continues further than we've actually modelled it, and also getting around the fact that the individual tracks are probably too short to look good. Even though with switching only a couple of cars to each car spot, the tracks are long enough to do their job. In this view, I filled in a lot more of the detail in the paper mill, and also shown what it would take scenically to hide where the main line and the interchange yard pierce the backdrop. Here is the upper deck in its final form with all the structures and scenery suggestions filled in. I was able to get quite a lot of industry around the main yard in 3 different areas. There are 3 industries on 4 spurs next to the door. There's 2 more industrial spurs behind the rip track. The reversing loop heads into an industrial structure, but it's actually a dummy industry as there isn't really enough space to spot cars there without fouling the first off the staging tracks. And in this corner there are a lot of spurs, including a TOFC ramp, allowing his piggyback cars to be switched here instead of just appearing on run-through trains. Here is the lower level with all the scenery filled in. We can see that I've now filled in this area as a quarry instead of a mine. It's not going to be a deep pit, instead it's just going to be cut into the cliffs beside the river. I've shown pulpwood loading at this point, although after I sent off this final version I thought of an improvement. Swapping the pulpwood loading with this brown industry in the corner would probably make better use of the space, since the industry can make do with shallow backdrop flats at this point. There'd be a lot more space for the pulpwood area in the corner, because if we notice here, there was no room for a road or driveway, whereas there would be plenty of space for that if we put it in this corner. So that's one alteration I recommended after I sent off this design. We can also see how this long industrial spur extends into a building and through the backdrop, allowing for an extra couple of car lengths of space. And the first half of that same spur can be used as a team track, providing 4 industries to switch at this point instead of just 3. Anyway, that is about all there is for this layout design. Here is a clean view of the upper level with all the annotations removed. Feel free to pause it if you want to. And here is a clean version of the lower deck. I'm going to sign off here, and I hope to see you back next week. So until then, thanks for watching, and bye for now.